Pick it up. Then maybe you will finally have $5. The laughter came instantly. A few customers near the checkout counters smiled. Someone by the coffee station shook his head and chuckled. Another customer pulled out a phone, sensing the kind of public embarrassment people seem to enjoy recording these days. Standing in the middle of the convenience store, Isaiah Walker slowly lowered his eyes toward the crumpled $5 bill lying on the polished floor. Rain tapped softly against the giant front windows. The gray afternoon sky turned the parking lot outside into a sheet of reflections and puddles. Isaiah did not move. His worn brown coat hung heavily from his shoulders. The cuffs were frayed. His boots carried the stains of countless miles walked across city streets. A faded knit cap covered most of his silver hair. To nearly everyone inside the store, he looked like exactly what they assumed he was. A homeless man with nothing. Brian Sullivan leaned casually against the counter, enjoying every second of the attention. His white dress shirt was perfectly pressed. His manager badge gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights. "What is the matter?" he asked loudly. "Too proud to pick up free money?" More laughter drifted through the aisles. Isaiah looked at the bill for another moment. Then he lifted his gaze toward Brian. His expression remained calm. Not angry, not embarrassed, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying years most people never bother to imagine. "Keep it," Isaiah said quietly. The response surprised a few customers. Brian smirked. "That is funny coming from a man who probably needs it more than anybody in this building." Isaiah glanced briefly toward the large photograph hanging near the customer service desk. Most people never paid attention to it. It showed the founder of the store chain smiling during a ribbon-cutting ceremony decades earlier. The frame was slightly crooked. Dust collected along one corner. Yet Isaiah's eyes lingered there for several seconds. Brian noticed. "What are you looking at?" he asked. Isaiah did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked back at the $5 bill on the floor. Rainwater slid down the windows behind him in slow silver streams. Somewhere near the back of the store, a refrigeration unit hummed steadily. "Nothing," Isaiah finally said. Brian laughed. "That sounds about right." Several customers joined in again. Yet not everyone seemed comfortable. A young cashier named Megan watched from behind her register. She had seen Isaiah before. Every Thursday afternoon, almost the exact same time. He never bothered anyone. Never asked for money. Never caused problems. He would come inside, warm up for a few minutes, buy a small coffee if he could afford one, and leave. The laughter began fading. Isaiah slowly reached into the pocket of his old coat. Brian's grin widened. "What is that?" he asked. "You finally found your $5? Isaiah's fingers closed around something hidden deep inside the pocket. For a brief moment, his expression changed. Not fear, not hesitation, recognition, as though he had touched something far more valuable than money. Then he looked once more toward the founder's photograph and quietly asked a question that made the nearest cashier stop breathing for a second. "They still keep his picture here?" The question settled over the store like a sudden change in weather. Even Brian's smile faded for a moment. Megan looked from Isaiah to the photograph and back again. Nobody expected a homeless man to care about an old picture hanging on the wall. Brian recovered first. "Of course they keep it there," he said. "He founded the company." Isaiah nodded slowly. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph. The founder's smile seemed frozen in another time, another life. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows. "I am surprised it is still here," Isaiah said quietly. Brian folded his arms. "Why would that surprise you?" A few customers lingered nearby, pretending to browse shelves while listening closely. Isaiah slipped his hand from his pocket, but did not reveal what he had been holding. Instead, he walked a few steps closer to the customer service desk. His boots left faint traces of water on the polished floor. "Most places replace old things eventually," he said. "Pictures, promises, memories." Brian rolled his eyes. "You sound like you knew him personally." The words were meant as another joke. Several people waited for someone to laugh. Nobody did. Isaiah studied the photograph for a few seconds longer. Then he smiled faintly. It was a smile filled with memory rather than amusement. "A long time ago," he said, "he used to hate having his picture taken." Megan blinked. Brian frowned. "What?" Isaiah shrugged. He always said photographs made him look uncomfortable. A customer near the coffee station glanced toward the portrait. The founder did look slightly uncomfortable. It was a strange detail. The kind of detail that sounded too specific to invent. Brian noticed the shift in attention and immediately pushed back. Anybody could make that up. Isaiah nodded. That is true. The calmness of the response somehow made Brian even more irritated. Outside, a delivery truck pulled into the parking lot. Headlights reflected across puddles gathered near the curb. Inside, the atmosphere continued changing. The laughter was gone now. Curiosity had taken its place. Megan stepped away from her register. Have you been here before? She asked carefully. Isaiah looked at her and smiled. Many times. No, she said. I mean years ago. For a moment Isaiah did not answer. His gaze drifted toward the front windows where rainwater slid slowly down the glass. A very long time ago, he finally said. Brian let out a short laugh. Sure. But even he sounded less certain now. Isaiah reached into his coat pocket again. This time he removed a worn leather wallet. The edges were cracked from age. The leather had faded unevenly after years of use. It did not look valuable. It looked old. Extremely old. Brian smirked. There it is. The famous $5. Yet Isaiah never opened the wallet. Instead, he ran his thumb gently across its surface as though touching something important hidden inside. His expression softened. The room grew quiet once more. Megan noticed that his hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear. From emotion. Then Isaiah looked directly at the founder's photograph and asked a second question that made several customers exchange confused glances. Does anybody here remember what he was doing before he opened his first store? The question lingered in the air. Nobody answered. Customers glanced at one another. Megan looked toward the founder's photograph as if the frame itself might reveal the answer. Brian folded his arms tighter. What difference does it make? He asked. Isaiah slowly turned toward him. Because the answer tells you what kind of man he was before he became successful. Rain continued falling outside, softer now, tapping against the glass like distant fingertips. A customer near the magazine rack shrugged. I do not know. Maybe business school. Another customer laughed quietly. Probably finance. Isaiah smiled faintly and shook his head. No. The room grew still again. Brian rolled his eyes. Let me guess. You know the answer. Isaiah looked down at the worn wallet in his hands. The leather was cracked and faded, carrying the marks of decades. He drove deliveries. Megan blinked. Deliveries? Isaiah nodded. Long days. Old truck. Bad heater. Not much money. Something about the way he said it sounded less like a fact and more like a memory. Brian noticed it too. And how exactly would you know that? Isaiah looked toward the photograph again. Because he complained about that heater every chance he got. A few customers exchanged glances. The detail was oddly specific. Too ordinary to sound invented. Brian laughed, but the sound lacked confidence. Convenient story. Isaiah accepted the comment without reaction. He slowly opened the wallet. Several people leaned forward. Even Brian's eyes dropped toward it. Inside were no stacks of cash. No credit cards. No hidden fortune. Just old paper. Folded carefully. Protected for years. Isaiah slid a small photograph partway out before stopping. He stared at it for a second. His expression softened. The fluorescent lights reflected in his eyes. Funny thing about life, he said quietly. The people who help build something are usually forgotten once the building is finished. Megan listened closely. Something about Isaiah no longer matched the image everyone had formed when he walked through the door. He still wore the same old coat. The same worn boots. Yet the room seemed to see him differently now. Brian noticed the shift and did not like it. If you are trying to impress people, it is not working. Isaiah looked at him calmly. I am not trying to impress anyone. Then he carefully removed the photograph from the wallet. The edges were yellowed with age. The image had faded. Nobody could see it clearly from where they stood. Then show us. Brian's voice came quickly. Show everybody. Isaiah studied the photograph for a moment longer. Outside, a flash of sunlight briefly broke through the clouds before disappearing again. The store felt unusually quiet. Even the customers recording with their phones had stopped speaking. Slowly, Isaiah lifted his eyes. You know, he said, looking toward the founder's portrait. The last time I saw him, he promised he would never forget where he came from. Megan felt a chill run through her arms. Brian opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the automatic front door slid open. A cold gust of damp air swept into the store. Everyone turned toward the entrance. And the moment Isaiah saw who had just walked in, his entire expression changed. The woman who entered looked completely out of place against the backdrop of rain-soaked jackets and convenience store shelves. She wore a dark wool coat tailored with quiet elegance, and a leather portfolio rested beneath one arm. Water glistened on her shoulders from the storm outside. The moment she stepped through the doorway, several employees straightened instinctively. Brian immediately recognized her. His eyes widened. "Ms. Brooks?" he said before he could stop himself. Evelyn Brooks rarely visited individual locations without notice. As chief executive officer of the company, she usually appeared only at major meetings or corporate events. Yet she was standing there now, looking past everyone in the store, past the customers, past the employees, past Brian. Her attention settled entirely on Isaiah. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of rain faded into the background. Isaiah slowly lowered the old photograph in his hand. A faint smile appeared on his face. It was the smile of someone recognizing a memory rather than a person. Evelyn's expression softened immediately. "Isaiah," she said quietly. The name carried genuine warmth. Several customers exchanged startled glances. Brian felt his stomach tighten. Isaiah nodded politely. "It has been a while." Evelyn stepped closer. Her eyes moved to the worn wallet, the old photograph, and finally the founder's portrait hanging on the wall. Understanding crossed her face almost instantly. "You were talking about him again." Isaiah glanced toward the photograph and smiled. People were asking questions. A few customers looked at one another. Nobody had been asking questions before Isaiah arrived. Now everyone had dozens of them. Brian forced a nervous laugh. "You know each other?" Evelyn turned toward him. "Of course we do." The answer came so naturally that Brian wished he had never spoken. Evelyn looked back at Isaiah. "My father used to tell stories about you." The room fell silent. Megan's eyes widened. Several customers stopped pretending to browse merchandise. Even the delivery driver who had entered moments earlier remained near the door listening. Isaiah lowered his gaze. "Your father always exaggerated." Evelyn laughed softly. "No. If anything, he left things out." Brian felt the blood drain from his face. His mind raced through everything he had said during the last 20 minutes. The jokes, the insults, the $5 bill still lying on the floor. None of it felt funny anymore. Evelyn noticed the bill near the register and then looked at Brian. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes made him uncomfortable. She turned back toward Isaiah. "I have been hoping to see you again." Isaiah looked genuinely surprised. "Why?" Evelyn adjusted the portfolio beneath her arm. "Because there is something my father asked me to do if I ever found you." The words landed heavily. Isaiah stared at her. For the first time since entering the store, uncertainty appeared on his face. Outside, the clouds began to thin. A faint beam of sunlight broke through the rain and stretched across the parking lot. Inside, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And as Evelyn slowly opened the leather portfolio she had carried through the storm, every person in the store suddenly understood that whatever happened next was about to change everything. For several seconds, the only sound inside the store was the soft rustle of paper as Evelyn opened the portfolio. Rain still clung to the windows, but the storm outside was losing strength. Pale sunlight flickered through gaps in the clouds, casting shifting reflections across the polished floor. Isaiah watched quietly. His weathered hands rested around the old wallet. The founder's photograph remained above the customer service desk, overlooking the scene like a silent witness. Brian stood frozen near the counter. He no longer looked like the confident manager who had laughed at a homeless man 20 minutes earlier. Evelyn carefully removed a sealed envelope from the portfolio. The paper was cream-colored and thick with age. Several customers leaned forward. Megan felt her heart begin to race. Even from a distance, the envelope looked important. Evelyn held it gently. "My father gave me this almost 10 years ago," she said. Her voice was calm, but emotion lingered beneath the surface. "He told me there was only one person in the world it belonged to." Isaiah stared at the envelope without speaking. His expression had become unreadable. "I told him he should deliver it himself," Evelyn continued. "But he said life does not always give us that choice." The room remained silent. Brian glanced toward the founder's photograph and then back toward Isaiah. Every new detail seemed to pull the story further away from anything he had imagined. Evelyn stepped closer and extended the envelope. "He asked me to give this to you if I ever found you again." Isaiah hesitated before accepting it. His fingers brushed the paper carefully. The movement was slow, almost reverent. The envelope already carried a name written across the front in fading blue ink. Isaiah Walker. Megan covered her mouth with one hand. The envelope had clearly been waiting for years. Isaiah lowered his eyes and studied the handwriting. The moment he saw it, something softened in his face. He recognized it immediately. "That is his writing," he whispered. Evelyn nodded. "Every letter." Isaiah exhaled slowly. For a moment he seemed far away, standing somewhere in a memory nobody else could see. Then he carefully opened the envelope. Inside rested a folded letter and a faded photograph. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the page. The customers watched in complete silence. Even the cash registers seemed forgotten. Isaiah read the first line and closed his eyes briefly. A faint smile appeared. "What does it say?" Megan asked softly. Isaiah looked up. The fluorescent lights reflected in his eyes. "It says he never forgot." The words settled heavily across the room. Brian felt a knot form in his stomach. Isaiah looked back down and continued reading silently. Several seconds passed. Then his gaze stopped. He stared at a paragraph near the bottom of the page. His expression changed. Surprise. Genuine surprise. Evelyn noticed it immediately. "You reached that part." Isaiah looked at her. "You knew?" She nodded. "That is why I have been trying to find you." Isaiah lowered the letter slowly. His eyes moved from the page to Evelyn, then back again. Whatever he had just read was far bigger than a memory, far bigger than a promise. And as the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the storm outside, every person in the store could see that the story was only beginning to reveal its most important secret. Isaiah continued staring at the letter long after everyone else would have looked away. The paper seemed almost weightless in his hands, yet the words written across it carried the weight of decades. Sunlight slowly spread across the floor as the storm outside weakened. Water droplets clung to the windows like tiny crystals. The customers remained where they were, suspended between curiosity and disbelief. Nobody wanted to leave. Nobody wanted to miss whatever came next. Evelyn watched Isaiah carefully. She had seen that expression before. Years ago, she had seen the same look on her father's face whenever he spoke about him. Brian shifted uneasily near the counter. The $5 bill still lay forgotten on the floor. What had started as a joke now felt like a mistake that kept growing larger with every passing minute. Isaiah finally lowered the letter. His eyes moved slowly across the room before returning to Evelyn. "He actually did it," he said quietly. Evelyn nodded. "Yes." Isaiah looked back at the page. "I thought he was joking." A faint smile appeared on Evelyn's face. "My father never joked about promises." Megan took a small step closer. "What did he do?" she asked. Isaiah hesitated. For a moment, he seemed reluctant to speak about himself. Then he carefully folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. "Many years ago," he said, "your founder got stranded on a highway during a winter storm." The room grew still again. His truck broke down. Nobody stopped to help. Traffic kept moving. Everybody was in a hurry to get somewhere else. Isaiah glanced toward the photograph on the wall. I pulled over. His voice remained calm. Matter of fact, I spent nearly 4 hours helping him get the truck running again. A customer near the beverage coolers frowned. That was it. Isaiah smiled faintly. That was enough. Evelyn nodded. My father used to say that day changed his life. Brian stared in confusion. He could not understand how a simple act of kindness could lead to everything happening in front of him now. Isaiah seemed to read the question in his face. Sometimes people do not remember what you gave them, he said quietly. They remember how you treated them when nobody else cared. Silence followed. Unlike the old letter, this one looked new. Official. Several pages bound together. She handed it to Isaiah. His brow furrowed as he opened it. The moment he read the first page, he froze. The expression on his face changed completely. Not surprise this time. Shock. Genuine shock. His hands tightened around the document. Evelyn's eyes softened. My father created a trust before he passed away, she said. A trust with your name on it. The room seemed to stop breathing. Brian felt his heart sink. Megan stared at Isaiah. The customers exchanged stunned looks. Isaiah slowly lifted his eyes from the page. For the first time all afternoon, he appeared completely speechless. And everyone in the store suddenly realized that whatever number was written inside that document was about to change far more than a single afternoon. Isaiah looked at the document again as if the words might change if he blinked. They did not. The trust was real. His name appeared clearly across the top of the page. The legal language beneath it stretched across several paragraphs, but only one detail seemed to matter. Walter had remembered. Through every year, every success, every store that opened across the country, he had remembered. Sunlight continued spreading through the windows, turning the rain-soaked parking lot outside into a field of shimmering reflections. Inside the store, nobody spoke. Brian could feel the silence pressing against him from every direction. He had spent the afternoon assuming he understood exactly who Isaiah was. Now he was not sure he understood anything at all. Evelyn stepped beside Isaiah and gently pointed toward a section of the document. "That part was added personally by my father," she said. Isaiah read the paragraph again. His fingers tightened slightly around the paper. "He actually wrote this himself?" Evelyn nodded. "Every word." Megan leaned forward from behind the counter, unable to hide her curiosity. Several customers did the same. Isaiah lowered the document and looked toward the founder's photograph. His eyes seemed distant. Walter always wrote things down when they mattered. Evelyn smiled softly. That never changed. The room remained still. Then Isaiah carefully handed the document back to her. "I cannot take this." The reaction surprised everyone. Brian blinked. Megan stared. Even Evelyn looked caught off guard. "Why not?" she asked. Isaiah glanced toward the photograph again. "Because I did not help him expecting anything in return." Evelyn's expression softened even further. "That is exactly what he said you would say." A few customers exchanged emotional smiles. Isaiah shook his head. "He knew me too well." Evelyn opened the document once more and showed him another page. "Then read the next section." Isaiah hesitated before taking it back. His eyes moved slowly down the page. This time the surprise that crossed his face was different. Not shock. Understanding. The trust was not simply for him. A portion of it had been designated to support shelters, job training programs, and housing assistance for people struggling to rebuild their lives. Programs Walter believed in because of the stories Isaiah had shared with him decades earlier. Isaiah exhaled slowly. The weight of the moment settled across his shoulders. He turned a promise into something bigger. Evelyn nodded. "He wanted one act of kindness to keep helping people long after both of you were gone." Brian lowered his eyes. Every word seemed to expose how small his earlier behavior had been. The $5 bill remained on the floor between them, now looking ridiculous compared to everything happening around it. Isaiah folded the document carefully. His expression had become calm again, yet there was moisture gathering in the corners of his eyes. He looked toward the founder's photograph one more time and smiled. "You stubborn old man," he whispered. A few customers quietly laughed through their emotions. Then Evelyn reached into her portfolio once more. This time she removed a faded photograph that nobody else in the room had seen before. The moment Isaiah looked at it, all the color seemed to leave his face, and everyone standing nearby immediately realized the photograph contained the final piece of a story that had remained hidden for nearly 30 years. Isaiah stared at the photograph as though the world around him had disappeared. The faded image showed two men standing beside an old delivery truck on the shoulder of a highway. Rain clouds filled the background. One of the men was a younger Walter. The other was Isaiah himself, nearly 30 years younger, smiling in a way nobody inside the store had seen all afternoon. His hand trembled slightly as he took the photograph from Evelyn. "I thought this was lost," he said quietly. Evelyn shook her head. "My father kept it in his office until the day he passed away." The room remained silent. Customers who had arrived only minutes earlier now stood frozen beside shelves of snacks and bottled drinks, completely absorbed in a story they never expected to witness. Brian could not take his eyes off the photograph. The homeless man he had mocked was standing beside the founder of the entire company in a picture that clearly predated every store in the region. Isaiah studied the image carefully. His thumb brushed across the faded surface. "That truck," he whispered. "I remember that truck." A faint smile appeared on his face. The heater barely worked. The windshield leaked every time it rained. Several customers laughed softly. Not at Isaiah. With him. The mood had changed again. The laughter that once carried judgment now carried warmth. Evelyn smiled. "My father told that story hundreds of times." Isaiah lowered the photograph. "He always made it sound more dramatic than it was." "No," Evelyn replied gently. "He always said he could never describe it well enough." Her words settled over the room. Isaiah looked toward the founder's portrait hanging above the customer service desk. Sunlight now illuminated part of the frame. The storm outside had almost completely passed. Bright patches of blue sky were beginning to appear between the clouds. Evelyn reached into the portfolio once more. This time she removed a small notebook with a worn leather cover. There is one more thing. Isaiah frowned slightly. What is that? Evelyn opened the notebook carefully. Several pages were marked with folded corners. My father's personal journal. A collective murmur spread through the customers. Isaiah looked genuinely surprised. Walter kept journals? Evelyn laughed softly. Every day for nearly 40 years. She turned several pages before stopping. This entry was written the night he met you. Isaiah stared at the page. Evelyn began reading aloud. Today I met a man who reminded me that success has nothing to do with money. My truck broke down. Everyone else drove past. One stranger stopped. He spent hours helping me in the rain and refused every dollar I offered. If I ever build the future I dream about, I hope I become half the man he already is. The store fell completely silent. Megan wiped a tear from her cheek. A customer near the coffee station lowered his head. Brian looked down at the floor. The $5 bill still lay there between them. Suddenly, it seemed smaller than a piece of dust. Isaiah slowly closed his eyes. For a moment, he could almost hear Walter's voice again. Then he opened them and looked toward Evelyn. He really wrote that? Evelyn nodded. And there is something else in the journal. Isaiah's brow furrowed. What? Evelyn gently turned to the final marked page. The reason he never stopped looking for you. Isaiah looked at Evelyn without speaking. The sunlight coming through the windows had grown brighter now, filling the store with a warmth that felt completely different from the cold gray afternoon that had begun this strange day. Evelyn rested the journal carefully in her hands. The pages were worn from years of use. The handwriting inside belonged to a man whose photograph watched over the room from the wall. After the company became successful, Evelyn said softly, my father hired private investigators twice. Isaiah blinked. Investigators? She nodded. He tried to find you. The customers stared in disbelief. Brian felt his throat tighten. Isaiah looked away for a moment. His eyes drifted toward the parking lot outside where puddles reflected the clearing sky. Why? He asked quietly. Evelyn smiled sadly. Because he regretted losing contact with you. The room remained silent. She opened the journal and continued reading. I built stores. I built a company. I built a future. Yet I never found the man who reminded me what kind of person I wanted to become. If I ever find Isaiah Walker again, I want him to know that every good thing in my life began on the side of a highway when a stranger decided I was worth helping. Megan lowered her eyes. Several customers wiped at tears they had not expected. Isaiah stood motionless. The words seemed almost impossible for him to absorb. Walter never told me any of that, he said. He probably thought it would embarrass him. Evelyn replied with a small laugh. A few people smiled. That sounded exactly like the man they were beginning to know through these stories. Evelyn turned one final page. Tucked inside was a folded note. She removed it carefully and handed it to Isaiah. Unlike the others, this note was short. Only a few lines. Isaiah unfolded it and read silently. His eyes widened. Then he laughed. A genuine laugh. The first one anyone had heard from him all day. What does it say? Megan asked. Isaiah shook his head and smiled. It says that if I ever showed up in one of his stores looking old and stubborn, somebody should buy me a coffee and tell me I was right all along. The room erupted into soft laughter. Even Brian laughed, though his eyes were wet. The tension that had filled the store for nearly an hour finally began to break apart. Isaiah folded the note carefully and slipped it into the old wallet beside the photograph. Then he looked up at Walter's portrait. Sunlight now illuminated the entire frame. For a moment it felt as if the founder himself were standing there smiling at the scene below. Isaiah nodded slowly toward the photograph. You finally got the last word. Evelyn smiled. He usually did. Around them, customers began speaking again. Registers resumed beeping. The ordinary sounds of life slowly returned. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Brian looked at the $5 bill still lying on the floor and realized he had never felt smaller. Meanwhile, Isaiah stood quietly beneath the founder's photograph, holding a worn wallet filled with memories, unaware that the greatest change in the room was no longer happening to him. It was happening to everyone who had witnessed the story. Brian remained near the counter long after the laughter had faded. The store had begun returning to normal on the surface. Customers picked up baskets. A register opened. Someone near the coffee station resumed filling a paper cup. Yet beneath those ordinary sounds, something fundamental had shifted. Brian could feel it. Every time he glanced toward Isaiah, he was reminded of the assumptions he had made within seconds of seeing him walk through the door. Isaiah, meanwhile, seemed completely unaware of the attention surrounding him. He carefully placed Walter's note back into the old wallet and slipped it into his coat pocket. The movement was simple, almost routine, as though he had spent years carrying memories far more valuable than money. Evelyn closed the journal and portfolio. "There is one more thing my father wanted," she said. Isaiah looked at her curiously. "Another letter?" Evelyn smiled. "No." She glanced around the store. "He wanted people to know the truth." The room grew quiet again. Isaiah shook his head gently. "The truth is not that important." Several customers looked surprised by the answer. Evelyn laughed softly. "That is exactly why it is important." She stepped toward the founder's photograph hanging above the customer service desk. Most people see this picture and think they are looking at a successful businessman. Her eyes moved toward Isaiah. "My father saw something different." Isaiah lowered his gaze. Evelyn continued. "He believed every success story begins with someone who showed kindness when it was not required." Megan listened carefully. A customer near the entrance slowly nodded. Brian stared at the floor. The words seemed directed at everyone in the room. Evelyn reached into the portfolio one final time and removed a laminated newspaper clipping. The paper had yellowed with age, but the photograph printed in the center remained visible. It showed a young Walter standing in front of his first store. Beside him stood Isaiah. The headline read, "Local Business Opens First Market." Few people noticed the second man in the picture. Walter had circled him with a pen. On the margin, he had written 4 words. "Never forget this man." Megan felt a lump form in her throat. Isaiah looked genuinely embarrassed. Walter always had a dramatic side. Several customers laughed warmly. Evelyn smiled. He inherited that from his mother. Even Isaiah laughed. The sound seemed to brighten the entire room. Brian finally looked up. For the first time all afternoon, Isaiah's eyes met his. There was no anger there. No resentment. No desire to make him suffer for what had happened. Somehow that kindness hurt more than any punishment could have. Brian swallowed hard. The $5 bill remained on the floor between them like a reminder of the person he had been less than an hour ago. Slowly, he bent down and picked it up. The paper felt strangely heavy in his hand. Then he looked toward Isaiah and took a step forward, knowing there was something he needed to say before this day came to an end. Brian stopped a few feet away from Isaiah. The $5 bill remained folded in his hand. For a moment, he simply stood there beneath the bright fluorescent lights, searching for words that felt large enough to carry the weight of what he had done. None of them seemed adequate. The customers watched quietly. Even the ordinary sounds of the store had faded again. Isaiah looked at him calmly. The same calm expression he had worn from the beginning. Brian lowered his eyes. "I was wrong." The words came out softer than he intended. Nobody laughed. Nobody interrupted. Isaiah remained silent, allowing him to continue. Brian glanced at the bill in his hand and gave a small, embarrassed shake of his head. "When you walked through that door, I decided who you were before you said a single word." His voice tightened slightly. "I looked at your coat, your boots, your situation. Then I filled in the rest of the story myself." Sunlight continued streaming through the windows, illuminating the puddles outside. Isaiah listened without judgment. Somehow that made the apology even harder. Brian took a slow breath. "The truth is, I never saw you." The words hung heavily in the air. Megan lowered her eyes. Several customers nodded quietly. Isaiah looked toward the founder's photograph and then back at Brian. "Most people do that," he said gently. Brian frowned. "You are not angry." Isaiah smiled faintly. Being angry would not change what happened. The answer struck Brian harder than any accusation could have. He looked at the $5 bill again. Earlier it had felt like a joke. Now it felt like evidence. Evidence of the worst version of himself. Slowly, he walked to the donation jar sitting beside the register. Without saying a word, he slipped the bill inside. The paper disappeared among the loose bills and coins already there. Then he turned back toward Isaiah. "I cannot undo what I said." Isaiah nodded. "No." Brian swallowed. "But I would like to do better." For the first time, a genuine smile reached Isaiah's eyes. "That is all anybody can do." The simplicity of the answer seemed to surprise everyone. Evelyn watched the exchange quietly. Her father would have appreciated this moment. Not because someone had been embarrassed, not because a secret had been revealed, but because a person had chosen to change. Brian looked around the store. The customers, the employees, the founder's photograph. Then his gaze returned to Isaiah. "You know," he said, almost laughing at himself. "I spent years believing success meant being in charge." Isaiah tilted his head slightly. "And now?" Brian glanced toward the donation jar. "Now I think it might mean becoming the kind of person people remember for the right reasons." The room grew quiet once more. Isaiah looked toward Walter's photograph. Sunlight covered the frame completely now. Walter figured that out a long time ago. Brian followed his gaze and nodded. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The silence felt peaceful rather than uncomfortable. Then Isaiah reached into his coat pocket and touched the old wallet. The letters, the photograph, the memories. Everything he had carried for years suddenly felt a little lighter. Yet as he looked around the store one more time, he realized the most valuable thing Walter had left behind was not hidden inside a trust, a journal, or a photograph. It was standing right here in front of him, beginning to grow inside the hearts of people who had finally learned to see. The afternoon sun continued pouring through the large front windows, transforming the store from the cold gray space it had been only an hour earlier. The rain had stopped completely. Outside, cars moved through puddles that reflected patches of blue sky. Inside, customers slowly returned to their routines, yet many remained nearby, unwilling to walk away from a story that had touched something deeper than curiosity. Isaiah stood quietly beneath Walter's photograph. The old wallet rested safely inside his coat pocket. The trust documents remained with Evelyn. The journal had been closed. Yet somehow the most important part of the day seemed to have nothing to do with papers, money, or promises. Evelyn stepped closer to Isaiah and looked up at her father's portrait. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she smiled. He would have loved this. Isaiah laughed softly. No, he would have complained about all the attention. A few people nearby smiled. The image felt easy to imagine. Evelyn nodded. That too. Megan left her register and approached them holding a fresh cup of coffee. Steam curled upward into the sunlight. "This is for you," she said. Isaiah looked surprised. "You do not have to do that." Megan smiled. "I know." The answer reminded everyone of something Walter might have said. Isaiah accepted the cup carefully. The warmth settled into his hands. For a brief moment, he simply stood there enjoying the feeling. It had been a long time since someone had offered him something without expecting anything in return. Brian watched from across the store. Earlier that afternoon, he would have seen a homeless man accepting free coffee. Now he saw something entirely different. He saw a person whose quiet act of kindness decades ago had continued, changing lives long after anyone expected it to matter. The realization stayed with him. Evelyn glanced around the store and then toward Isaiah. "There is another reason my father created the trust." Isaiah looked at her curiously. "What is that?" Evelyn's eyes softened. "He hoped you would help decide where some of it goes." Isaiah blinked. "Me? Yes." She smiled. "He trusted your judgment more than his own." Several customers exchanged surprised looks. Isaiah shook his head slowly. "Walter never stopped being ridiculous." Evelyn laughed. "That is probably true." Yet Isaiah could not hide the emotion in his eyes. For years he had carried memories of a friendship he assumed the world had forgotten. Now he was discovering that the friendship had never disappeared at all. It had simply continued growing in places he could not see. Sunlight illuminated the founder's portrait above them. The old photograph seemed brighter than before. Isaiah looked at it one more time. "You know," he said quietly, "I always thought helping him was one afternoon of my life." Evelyn followed his gaze. "And now?" Isaiah smiled. "Now I think it was the beginning of something neither of us understood." The room fell silent again. Not an uncomfortable silence. A peaceful one. The kind that settles in when people recognize they have witnessed something meaningful. Outside, a light breeze moved through the parking lot. Inside, beneath the warm afternoon sunlight, Isaiah realized that Walter's greatest gift had never been the trust itself. It was the proof that kindness could survive time, distance, and even loss, continuing its work long after the people who started it were gone. The store looked almost ordinary again by the time Isaiah finally prepared to leave. The afternoon sun shone brightly through the glass windows, washing away every trace of the storm that had greeted him when he arrived. Customers pushed carts through the aisles. Coffee machines hummed softly. Registers opened and closed. Life had resumed its familiar rhythm. Yet for everyone who had witnessed the events of the day, nothing felt quite the same. Isaiah stood near the entrance with a warm cup of coffee in one hand and the old wallet resting securely inside his coat pocket. The letters, photographs, and memories it carried no longer felt like pieces of a forgotten past. They felt alive. Evelyn walked beside him toward the door. "Will I see you again?" she asked. Isaiah smiled. "Probably." She laughed. "That sounds less certain than I hoped." "I spent most of my life surprising people," Isaiah replied. "No reason to stop now." Both of them smiled. Near the registers, Megan waved goodbye. Several customers did the same. Some had never spoken to Isaiah before today, yet they looked at him now with the familiarity usually reserved for old friends. Brian stood near the front entrance. He had spent the last hour thinking about everything that had happened. The lessons felt uncomfortable, but necessary. As Isaiah approached, Brian opened the door before he even reached it. Sunlight poured through the entrance. A cool breeze carried the clean scent of air after rain. "Thank you," Brian said quietly. Isaiah paused. "For what?" Brian looked toward the founder's photograph hanging above the customer service desk. "For reminding me that every person has a story I cannot see." Isaiah nodded. "That is a lesson worth keeping." Then he stepped outside. The parking lot glistened beneath the afternoon sun. Small puddles reflected patches of blue sky drifting between white clouds. Isaiah walked slowly across the sidewalk, carrying nothing that appeared valuable to the people passing by. No expensive watch, no designer clothes, no sign of the trust that now bore his name. Yet somehow he seemed richer than anyone around him. Inside the store, Brian remained near the entrance watching him disappear into the distance. Several minutes later, another man approached the building. His clothes were worn. A backpack hung from one shoulder. He hesitated near the doorway, uncertain whether he would be welcomed. Brian did not hesitate. He stepped forward and held the door open. "Come on in," he said with a genuine smile. "The coffee is fresh." The man looked surprised, then grateful. He stepped inside. Brian glanced toward Walter's photograph one final time. Sunlight illuminated the frame. For a brief moment, he thought about the $5 bill, the old wallet, the letter, and the stranger he had judged without knowing. Then he smiled and returned to work. Far down the sidewalk, Isaiah continued walking beneath the clear afternoon sky. The breeze moved gently through the trees. The city carried on around him. He never looked back. He did not need to. Somewhere behind him, a promise made decades earlier had finally fulfilled itself. And somewhere ahead, because one man had chosen kindness on the side of a highway long ago, that kindness would continue traveling farther than either of them could have ever imagined.